It was the kind of evening that felt dipped in gold. The ballroom at Glen Haven Country Club glowed beneath the soft shimmer of string lights and crystal chandeliers. Outside, magnolias swayed gently in the early summer breeze. Inside, servers in pressed white shirts floated between tables with silver trays and soft shoes. The long-awaited retirement party for Bernard Tate, partner, mentor, and the beloved patriarch of Tate, Lang and Simmons Law, was finally in full swing. And at the center of it all stood Helen Mallory. She wore a deep forest green silk gown that clung softly to her figure, dignified and understated. Her silver hair was pulled into an elegant twist, and a delicate diamond pendant rested against her collarbone, the one Richard had given her on their 25th anniversary. That night had meant something. At least she used to think it did. Helen moved with grace, pausing every few steps to thank someone for coming, compliment a dress, or check in with the waitstaff. She wasn't just Bernard's executive assistant, she was the heart of his professional world. For 26 years, she'd held his calendars, his secrets, and sometimes his family together. At a corner table, her husband, Richard Mallory, sat with a neat drink in hand and a polite smile on his face. Navy blazer, burgundy tie, wedding ring glinting in the light. He looked like the picture of devotion. He had been retired for just under a year, and lately Helen couldn't decide whether he enjoyed the freedom or resented hers. Bernard took the stage with a clink of his glass. "Tonight is not just about me," he began, warm and humble, "but about the people who made 40 years of this madness worth every damn minute." The room laughed politely. Helen smiled, but her eyes scanned the crowd, reflexively, almost nervously. And then she arrived. Lillian Tate, Bernard's wife, breezed in through the side doors wearing a striking crimson gown. Not red, crimson, deep, unapologetic. Her hair was down in soft waves, lips painted to match. She looked 10 years younger than her 55, though Helen had always known the truth behind that illusion. She didn't make a grand entrance. No announcement, just a quiet glide to her husband's side, with a quick air kiss and a laugh that danced too long. And yet, Helen noticed it. Not the gown, not the lipstick, the glance. Richard looked at Lillian, not with the dull familiarity of a neighbor, or even polite admiration. Number. His gaze lingered just a half-second too long, and hers met his like it had practiced the motion. It passed quickly. Almost nothing. But Helen Mallory had built her life on reading pauses. She'd spent decades in boardrooms full of men who underestimated her until she noticed what they didn't say. She didn't forget those kinds of glances. The music picked up again, and the mingling resumed. Helen found herself standing at the punch table beside Richard. He touched her arm gently, smiled. "You've outdone yourself," he murmured. "Tate's lucky to have had you." Helen nodded. 40 years deserve something unforgettable. As she reached for a napkin, she noticed a faint smudge of crimson on Richard's wrist cuff. A small smear, almost invisible. Her hand paused in midair. It could have been punch. It could have been a stain from someone else's plate. But Helen didn't drink punch, and Richard hadn't eaten yet. She said nothing. From across the room, Lillian raised a glass to Helen with a bright smile. Helen returned it automatically, her stomach twisting under her calm exterior. Moments later, the evening's slideshow began. Childhood photos of Bernard, black and white firm pictures from the 80s, grainy clips of holiday parties. The room glowed with nostalgia. Helen watched, smiling at the appropriate times, standing beside her boss and his wife, and her own husband standing close, but somehow not close at all. She didn't know it yet, but that small smudge of lipstick on Richard's sleeve was not the first stain. And tonight's golden celebration? It would soon become the perfect stage for truth. The morning after the party, Helen stood by the window of their kitchen, hands wrapped around a warm mug of black tea, watching the sun crawl over the rooftops. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, and yet she felt a tightness beneath her ribs that wouldn't release. Richard was still asleep upstairs, snoring faintly, as he often did now that he no longer had to wake early for work. Retirement had made him slower, more sluggish, but also somehow more restless. He walked more, sat less, vanished into long errands without explanation. At first, Helen had chalked it up to adjustment. The man had worked nearly 50 years in the insurance world. He wasn't used to stillness. But over the last few months, things had shifted in their home, like a picture slightly off center. You don't notice right away until you start looking. It started small. Richard stopped joining her for their evening news ritual, opting instead to rest his eyes in the den. He'd always fallen asleep on the couch before, but now the naps seemed like a convenient escape. He became vague about where he went during the day. Just out for a walk, he'd mutter, or had to grab a part for the heater. Helen never pressed. She was never the type. But then he started smelling different. Not unclean, not even cologne. Perfume, floral, powdery, expensive, not hers. Once he came home with a sprig of lavender caught in his coat pocket. Another time, she noticed his phone buzz and light up on the kitchen counter. It was flipped down, but the screen flashed bright enough for her to catch a name. Just a letter, L. Her stomach nodded. The next time, there was no letter. Just missed call, private number. She had never been the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone, but now she couldn't help but wonder how long she'd been looking without seeing. At lunch with her daughter Claire, a week before the party, the tension finally surfaced. They were seated outside a quiet cafe, enjoying the early summer breeze when Claire put down her fork and asked carefully, "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" Helen paused mid-bite. "Why would you ask that?" Claire shrugged, eyes down. "Just, something feels off. He doesn't talk much anymore. At the barbecue last month, he barely looked at you. And," she hesitated, "I don't want to stir anything, but the way Lillian was talking to him, it wasn't just friendly." Helen forced a smile. "You've always had an imagination." Claire didn't push, but Helen saw it in her face. The worry, the curiosity. She wasn't a child anymore. And perhaps Helen's silence was no longer protecting anyone. Later that evening, while folding laundry, Helen pulled one of Richard's scarves from the pile, a soft, expensive cashmere one he'd insisted on keeping even in summer. She ran her fingers along the edges and paused. There it was again. Lipstick. Crimson. Faint but undeniable. She sat on the edge of their bed, scarf in her lap, and stared at the ceiling fan. Her mind tried to reason with her. Maybe it rubbed off from a hug. Maybe Lillian had leaned in too close. But that didn't explain the pocketed receipts, the long walks, the perfume that wasn't hers, the silence. The silence was the loudest part. One day, Helen stood in front of the mirror and caught herself adjusting her hair, not out of vanity, but out of comparison. Lillian Tate was nearly 15 years younger. She wore heels where Helen wore comfort flats, silk where Helen chose linen, red lipstick instead of rose gloss. She looked like a woman who expected to be seen. But there had always been something too perfect about her. Polished, yes, but hollow. Lillian's laugh was always a touch too loud, her compliments too scripted, her glances too directed. Suddenly, Helen remembered something from the party. Lillian had walked in late, but Richard had excused himself 10 minutes earlier. Gone to the lobby, he'd said, to check something with valet. Had they arrived together? The thought left her nauseous. That night, as Helen cleared the table, Richard came up behind her and kissed her cheek. "Dinner was wonderful, love," he murmured. "You're still the best cook I know." She turned, forcing a smile. "You're still the best liar I know." He blinked, confused. She didn't clarify. She just wiped her hands, turned off the kitchen lights, and went upstairs. Because while she didn't have proof yet, she now had something more dangerous. A motive. And once a woman like Helen has a motive, she doesn't need lipstick to make a statement. She needs truth. It was raining the morning Helen found the first piece of real evidence. Not a dramatic storm, not thunder or hail, just a quiet drizzle, soft against the kitchen window as she washed last night's tea mug. The world felt gray, dim in sois, but her mind was sharper than ever. Richard had gone out early, said he was meeting an old colleague for breakfast. He didn't say who. He rarely did these days. Helen dried her hands and walked past the coat rack. Something told her to pause. Something small and invisible. Maybe intuition. Maybe just spite. His jacket was hanging loosely over the hook, the same tweed one he wore the night of the retirement party. She reached into the inner pocket and found two things. One, a receipt from Lavalum, an upscale boutique in town. Two, a gift card already used with a handwritten message in script. For when I see you next. L. Helen's chest tightened. She knew Lavalum. That boutique didn't sell tools or books. It sold lingerie, fragrance, satin robes embroidered with initials. She took the receipt to the living room, sat down on the sofa, and stared at it like it might dissolve under pressure. $372. Charged to Richard Mallory's card. The items listed? Rose silk chemise, size M. Lace trim wrap robe, ivory. Signature scent, Crimson Dahlia, 50 milliliters. She blinked. Crimson, again. That damned color was following her like a ghost. She didn't go to Richard. She went to Claire. Can you do something for me? Helen asked that evening as they sat at the kitchen island. Claire looked up from her laptop. Of course. I want you to check something, quietly. Helen showed her the receipt, told her about the gift card. Claire's lips tightened as she read. You think Dad bought these for Lillian? I don't know who else wears crimson and ivory and signs her notes with L. Claire didn't argue. She pulled out her tablet, opened her work email and said, I have a few tools. I manage product databases all the time for work. If she's in the loyalty program or registered with this boutique, I might be able to see what's connected. Helen watched her daughter's fingers fly over the keyboard. She wasn't proud of this invasion, but she was past pride now. She needed the truth. 5 minutes later, Claire's screen lit up with a customer profile. Lillian Tate. Home address matched. Phone number, same as listed in last year's employee holiday list. Preferred scent, Crimson Dahlia. Last purchase, 3 days ago. Paid for, with a gift card ending in the same 4 digits as the one Richard had in his coat. Claire didn't say anything. She just turned the screen toward her mother. Helen said nothing either. Later that night, Helen sat alone in her bedroom and stared at the shadows in the corners. She thought of how carefully she had folded Richard's clothes every Sunday for decades. The way he used to come home with fresh tulips, the anniversary dinners, the long drives into the country. And now, Crimson Dahlia, lingerie, secret glances, Lillian. The next morning she made tea, added honey, and took it across the street to her friend and neighbor Nancy. The two women had been friends since the neighborhood was new, their kids young. If anyone would understand, Nancy would. They sat on the porch watching sparrows dart through puddles when Helen finally asked, Have you noticed anything strange lately? Nancy paused, then slowly said, You mean, besides Lillian's sudden interest in gardening? Helen raised a brow. Nancy sighed. I didn't want to say anything before, but about a week ago, I came home early from the grocery store. I saw your husband walking down the Tate's driveway, the guest house in the back. He looked flustered. I figured maybe he was helping with something, but he didn't see me, and Lillian came out right after, hair all tousled. Helen's face didn't change, but her fingers gripped the mug tighter. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. Nancy looked ashamed. I thought maybe I was seeing too much, reading into things. Helen nodded slowly. You weren't. They sat in silence for a long while. Then Helen said, I think it's time I stopped doubting myself. That afternoon, she pulled out the receipt, the loyalty database screenshot Claire printed, and a photo she quietly took of the scarf with lipstick. She placed them in a slim manila folder. She opened her laptop and searched a name. Jonas Ray, a quiet ex-detective turned PI, recommended by her late brother years ago. She had never called him, not until now. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. A man answered on the third ring. Ray, I need help, Helen said. It's my husband. I think he's having an affair, and I think the woman is my boss's wife. There was a pause on the line. Then, when can we meet? Helen didn't hesitate. Tomorrow morning, because now she had more than motive. She had intent. The next morning, Helen met Jonas Ray at a quiet corner cafe tucked beside the old train station. It was the kind of place people came to read in silence or meet without being noticed. Jonas wore a tan overcoat, rimmed glasses, and had the quiet, methodical energy of a man who had seen too much and reacted too little. He didn't smile when she arrived, just nodded toward the seat across from him and said, "Mrs. Mallory." "Helen," she replied, sliding into the booth and placing the manila folder between them. He opened it slowly, glancing at the receipt, the lipstick-stained scarf photo, the boutique printout. Then he tapped his index finger twice on the page showing Lillian Tate's customer profile. "Your boss's wife?" Helen nodded. "Do you want the truth?" Jonas asked. "Or something you can use?" She didn't even blink. "Both." Within 3 days, Jonas had results. He was quick, discreet, and as promised, thorough. Helen sat at her desk late in the evening, the house dark except for the dim pool of light over her keyboard, when his email came in. Subject, activity log, Richard Mallory. Attached photos, timestamps, locations. She clicked. The first photo made her breath catch. Richard, standing beside Lillian outside a small Airbnb cabin near Briar Lake, a place they'd once gone as a family when Claire was 12. Now he stood there again, in a pressed shirt and slacks, opening the passenger door as Lillian stepped out. Another image, the two of them seated close on a private patio, glasses of red wine between them, her hand brushing his thigh. And then one more, not grainy, not blurry, clear as crystal. A kiss, her husband, her boss's wife. Lips locked in the dusky amber of early evening. Helen stared at the photo longer than she should have, then closed the laptop lid without emotion. She thought she might cry, but she didn't, because grief is for what's lost. And Helen hadn't lost anything. It had already been taken from her. The next morning she texted Claire, "Come by tonight, bring your laptop." When her daughter arrived, Helen explained everything, carefully, clearly, like she was giving instructions in an operating room. Claire didn't ask many questions. She knew her mother. When Helen moved with that kind of calm, it meant things were already in motion. They sat together at the kitchen table while Helen opened a hidden folder on her desktop. Inside were scanned documents, zipped images, videos Jonas had sent with clear timestamps. Helen clicked open a program Claire had installed years ago for family slideshows. Fade Frame Pro. They began building it. Not the official slideshow. No. That one was already on Helen's USB stick for the event committee, filled with smiling photos of Bernard, award ceremonies, firm holiday parties, and candid pictures of the Tates at gala events. This one? This was for her. They named it Golden Hour Private. First slide, Helen and Richard's wedding photo, soft focus. Second slide, a list of dates, anniversaries, family milestones. Third slide, the boutique receipt. Fourth, photo of the scarf. And then the affair evidence. No music, just silence. Let the pictures do the talking. The next morning, Helen stood outside Bernard Tate's office, waiting to go over final plans for the ceremony. Lillian was already inside. Helen could hear her voice, bright and animated. She waited until Lillian came out. Their eyes met, just briefly. Helen smiled. Not forced, not fake, just sharp. "Lillian," she said with the gentleness of someone offering a handshake before a chess match. "Helen, oh my goodness, you were incredible last weekend. The party was stunning." Helen tilted her head. "Well, it's not over yet. The real celebration is still to come." Lillian blinked. Helen's smile didn't move. "Tell Richard I said hello." Then she turned and walked into Bernard's office like nothing had happened. 2 days before the retirement ceremony, Jonas handed Helen a small black USB drive. "This one's clean," he said. "Only photos, no audio. You'll want to control the reveal." Helen took it, slipping it into the inside pocket of her handbag. "Thank you." He paused. "One more thing," he added, pulling out a small envelope. "Found this in the Airbnb trash." Lillian's handwriting, she unfolded it. "You said she'd be gone by June. You promised this wouldn't be messy. I won't play secretary to your guilt. I want my name on something real." No signature, just that sentence. Helen stared at it for a long time. So this wasn't just an affair. It was a replacement. And yet, she couldn't shake a strange feeling. The note didn't sound seductive. It sounded resentful, desperate, controlled. That night, Helen sat at her dining table in the quiet dark and wrote her speech. Two versions, one filled with praise and warmth, the other laced with truth. And she wouldn't decide which to read until she took the stage. Helen couldn't sleep. She lay on her back in the quiet dark of her bedroom, staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle rhythm of Richard's breathing beside her. He'd fallen asleep with the television still buzzing in the den and shuffled up to bed only an hour ago, mumbling something about back pain and needing Tylenol. She didn't respond. She hadn't said goodnight, just watched him slip under the covers as if nothing in their world had changed. But everything had. She turned to the side, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. The air felt still, too still, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Downstairs, her laptop sat open with both speeches saved in separate files. Speech A, loyalty, legacy, and laughter. Speech B, the truth we pretend not to know. Helen had always believed in order, in preparation, but tonight something wouldn't settle. She rose quietly, wrapping her robe around her, and padded barefoot to her study. The house was silent. Even the refrigerator hum felt louder than usual. On the desk was a white envelope. She hadn't left it there. Cautiously, she opened it. Inside was a single printed photograph. Richard and Lillian in a kitchen. Her kitchen. The angle was unfamiliar, taken from behind a partially open door. Richard had his hand on Lillian's waist and she was smiling. But it wasn't joy on her face. It was fear. Behind them, standing in the blurred background, was another woman. Younger, maybe early 40s. Blonde. Dressed casually, arms folded across her chest, watching them. Her face was partially turned from the camera, but something about the posture, the confidence, unsettled Helen deeply. The photo wasn't labeled. No note, no threat, just silence. Helen flipped it over. Nothing written. She stared at it again. The woman wasn't smiling, wasn't surprised. She was observing, as if evaluating two actors in a play. It felt wrong. Who took this? Why send it now? Suddenly, the affair wasn't the only secret in the room. The next morning, Helen clipped roses from her garden as the sun crept over the edge of the sky. The dew still clung to the petals as she arranged them in a tall glass vase for the reception hall. She wanted things to feel normal for just a few more hours. Richard came down the stairs in a gray suit and striped tie, whistling faintly. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing her on the cheek. She didn't answer, just smiled and handed him his coffee. He didn't notice her trembling hand. By mid-afternoon, the country club was bustling with activity. Waiters moved between tables, florists adjusted centerpieces, and audio techs ran last-minute checks on microphones and projector cables. The retirement ceremony was to begin at 6 sharp, followed by cocktails and speeches. Helen arrived early with Claire and Brian, the firm's tech assistant, to oversee the slideshow equipment. "Which folder should I load?" Brian asked, plugging Helen's laptop into the projector system. "That one," she said, "but leave this USB drive on standby." She slid Jonas's flash drive across the table, labeled only with a black dot. "It's the backup," Brian nodded, unfazed. "Got it." Claire leaned close to her mother. "Still sure you want to do this tonight?" Helen's answer was quiet. "I've been sure for years. I just didn't know it." At 5:20 p.m., Helen stepped into the powder room to freshen up. She adjusted her earrings and stared at herself in the mirror. Calm, controlled, elegant. But something still gnawed at her. The woman in the photo, that blurry figure in Lillian's kitchen. It wasn't random. The way she stood, the certainty in her posture, it was deliberate. Helen pulled out her phone and texted Jonas the photo, adding a single line. "Do you recognize her?" She didn't expect an answer right away. She also didn't expect her phone to buzz only 5 minutes later. "Jonas Ray. That's not Lillian's friend. Her name's Evelyn Marlowe. She used to work for Bernard Tate. She's not supposed to be anywhere near that family." Helen read the message twice. Another name, another lie. What had seemed like an affair was starting to feel like a setup, and not just for her. She stepped out of the restroom and into the hallway just as Lillian arrived, flanked by 2 friends in designer gowns and clutching a bottle of wine as a hostess gift. Her smile was brilliant, her makeup flawless. But when her eyes met Helen's, something flickered. Helen stepped forward with the practiced grace of a woman who had hosted hundreds of events. "Lillian," she said warmly, "you look radiant." "Thank you, Helen. You too." Helen leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You're not the only one in that photo, and you're not the only one who's afraid." Lillian's smile faded for a split second, but Helen had already turned and walked away. Because tonight wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about all of them. And Helen had one last gift to deliver: truth, dressed in silence, packaged in applause. The ballroom was bathed in warm golden light as the guests trickled in. Soft jazz filled the air, and the smell of rosemary-crusted lamb wafted from the kitchen. The stage was dressed with white flowers and a polished oak podium, and behind it, a large projection screen stood ready. Laughter echoed off the chandeliers. Toasts clinked. Champagne glasses sparkled like secrets waiting to spill. Helen stood near the back of the room in a champagne-colored gown. Classic. Timeless. The dress she wore to Claire's wedding a decade ago. A brooch Richard had gifted her on their anniversary gleamed from her shoulder. She didn't feel elegant. She felt sharp, focused. Tonight was a celebration, but not the one anyone expected. Richard was in his element, charming guests, patting backs, complimenting old colleagues' gray hair and younger wives. He moved through the crowd like the king of a castle that no longer belonged to him. Lillian arrived shortly after, glowing in silver satin, lips painted her signature crimson. She looked like a movie star playing the part of a perfect wife, but Helen had learned that perfection was usually an alibi. She watched as Richard and Lillian exchanged a glance across the room. It was subtle, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but not by Helen. Not anymore. As the first toast began, Mr. Bernard Tate took the stage. He looked tired but proud, eyes watery as he spoke about legacy, the changing of eras, and the people who had made the firm feel like a family. When he thanked Helen, his voice caught. "You've been more than an assistant, Helen. You've been my right hand, my calendar, my conscience. I couldn't have done it without you." Helen nodded from her table, holding his gaze with a warmth she didn't have to fake. Because Bernard was many things, but he wasn't a liar. He just didn't know what was hiding in his own house. Then Brian stepped to the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, grinning, "before we cut the cake, there's one more tribute. From the person who kept us all organized, who knows the birthdays of every single paralegal and the coffee preferences of every partner. My mom." Helen Mallory applause. Helen rose slowly. Each step toward the podium echoed like a ticking clock. She carried no notes. She didn't need any. She paused, letting the room settle. Then she spoke. "Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for being here tonight. 40 years at the same firm. 40 years of loyalty, of work, of showing up, whether or not it was appreciated. Bernard, you've built something rare here, and tonight should be a celebration." She smiled softly. "And it is. But celebrations are also for truth." The room shifted, glasses lowered, laughter quieted. "I've spent my career surrounded by facts, calendars, deadlines, documents, the things that keep the world spinning quietly in the background. I learned early on that if you want to find the truth, you follow the paper trail." She reached into the podium drawer and pressed the remote. Behind her, the screen came to life. The first slides were familiar. Bernard shaking hands with city officials, ribbon cuttings, holiday parties. The crowd smiled. Then the next slide appeared, Richard and Lillian, outside the Briar Lake Airbnb, arms around each other, a gasp. Helen didn't flinch. Another slide, the handwritten note. "You said she'd be gone by June." Lillian's face drained of color. Richard stood abruptly. "What the hell is this?" he snapped, his voice trembling. Helen ignored him. Another click. The photo of them kissing on the patio. Another gasp. A wine glass shattered somewhere in the crowd. Bernard stood slowly, staring at the screen like it had just punched him in the chest. Helen's voice never wavered. "This is my husband, Richard Mallory, and this is Lillian Tate. Together, repeatedly, while I was here, organizing this very celebration. While Bernard was preparing for retirement, While everyone else believed in something called integrity, Richard shouted, "You're insane! This is slander!" Helen turned to him, quiet and calm. "Then sue me. But before you do, check your calendar. Check the receipts. Check the scent still stuck to your scarf." She clicked one last time. The final image appeared. The photo from the envelope. Richard, Lillian, and the mystery woman in the background. Now the crowd wasn't just gasping. They were whispering. Lillian staggered backward. Her wineglass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the carpet. Helen turned to her, eyes steely. "Who is she, Lillian?" Lillian opened her mouth, but no words came. "I didn't think you'd tell me," Helen said. "But it doesn't matter. Jonas already did. Her name is Evelyn Marlowe, and she doesn't belong in your kitchen. She belongs in a courtroom." Helen stepped away from the podium, her final words falling over the stunned silence like a curtain. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. It's the last time any of you will see me smile at a lie." She walked out of the ballroom, heels clicking softly, the murmur of chaos rising behind her. And still, she never looked back. The ceremony didn't end with cake. It ended with chaos. Richard stormed out first, his voice booming down the marble hallway, slurring accusations, calling Helen vengeful, crazy, and dramatic. No one followed him. Lillian disappeared minutes later, red lipstick smeared, her silver heels in her hand. Silent and pale, she said nothing to Bernard, nothing to the guests. She simply left. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't laugh. Some hugged Helen awkwardly, others slipped away without a word. But no one, not one person, looked at her with pity, only awe. Helen sat alone in her car in the parking lot for 20 silent minutes, staring at the steering wheel. She didn't cry. She didn't smile either. She simply breathed. The next day, her phone didn't stop buzzing. Voicemails from neighbors, apologies from colleagues. Claire checking in with, "Proud of you, Mom. No regrets, right?" There were no regrets, only questions. Late in the afternoon, she received a call. "It's Jonas," the voice said. I dug deeper. Evelyn Marlowe didn't just work for Bernard. She was his former assistant, before you were hired. Helen sat up straighter. "Go on." "She was let go, quietly. There was a financial discrepancy, funds missing from the firm's community account. Bernard covered it up. She was never reported, just dismissed." Helen's fingers tightened on the phone. "That was over 25 years ago," Jonas continued. "She's resurfaced under different aliases a few times since then. Consulting work, estate management. You'll never guess who's been quietly funding her returns every few years." Helen already knew. "Richard." Bingo. It hit her like a wave. Lillian hadn't seduced Richard. She'd been caught between two manipulators, one clinging to his reputation, the other orchestrating a new con. Evelyn Marlowe wasn't an affair. She was a weapon. Jonas added, "That photo you received?" It wasn't to expose Lillian. It was to scare her. "To control her," Helen whispered, "and maybe to provoke you. Whoever sent it knew you wouldn't stay silent." Helen stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the rain pooling on the edge of her rose beds. She had exposed Richard's affair, but something far bigger was rotting beneath. The next morning, Bernard called. "Helen," he said, voice hollow, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything. Lillian swears it was a mistake, a moment of weakness." Helen almost laughed. "She was blackmailed, Bernard. She didn't fall. She was pushed." A pause, then softly, "Did you recognize her?" "You mean Evelyn?" Silence. "I didn't think she'd come back," he finally said. "I thought that part of my past was buried." "Nothing stays buried forever," Helen replied. Bernard sighed. "I'm sorry, Helen, for all of it. I never wanted you involved in any of this. But you brought me into it the moment you made Lillian your problem and expected the rest of us to clean it up." She hung up. That night, Claire brought over dinner. Her mother barely touched it. Instead, Helen handed her a stack of printed documents Jonas had sent. Claire flipped through them silently. Bank transfers. Company. Files, a revised estate document signed by Lillian 2 months ago. giving Evelyn shared administrative power over Bernard's assets in the event of medical incapacitation. Evelyn is bleeding them both, Helen whispered. Richard was probably paying her to stay quiet. Lillian signed everything out of fear. And Bernard, he didn't want a scandal. Claire frowned. So what do we do? Helen's answer was cold, steady. We finish what I started. Helen mailed a package the next morning, thick and marked confidential. It contained every document Jonas had uncovered, a detailed timeline, and a letter. The envelope was addressed to Olivia Tran, investigative journalist, Fraud and Elder Abuse Division. Helen didn't need revenge. She didn't want lawsuits or settlements. She wanted exposure. If the men in her life had spent decades silencing, hiding, and manipulating, then she would amplify the truth. Let the world see the rot beneath their polished suits. 2 days later, a headline lit up across the web. Power, Lies, and the Disappeared Assistant. Scandal rocks law firm patriarch. Helen read every line. The article didn't just tell her story, it told everyone's. Evelyn's fraud trail, Bernard's cover-up, Richard's private bank account linked to Evelyn's shell company. It was thorough, ruthless, clear. Helen received a call from Jonas the next morning. Thought you might want to know. Evelyn's gone. Left her apartment, no forwarding address, again. Helen didn't respond right away. She simply stood in her kitchen, staring at the roses blooming outside the window, then said quietly, "Let her run." Jonas hesitated. And Richard? Helen closed her eyes. I'm not finished with him yet. 3 days after the story broke, Helen walked into her lawyer's office and filed for separation. No drama, no lawyers from Richard's side, just a silent formality that ended something long broken. Richard never called, never showed up. But she heard he was staying with an old colleague out of town, avoiding the press, the firm, the family, especially Claire, who hadn't spoken to him since the night of the reveal. Helen didn't chase him. She didn't need to, because what he feared more than divorce was the loss of reputation, and that she had already taken from him. Weeks passed. Helen stayed with Claire for a while, then moved into a small rental house across town. It was modest, quiet, and filled with light. She planted roses in the yard, just like the ones she used to grow. This time she chose white, no more crimson. One morning a package arrived on her doorstep. No return address. Inside was a single photo. Richard and Evelyn at a marina, boarding a boat. He looked gaunt, older, desperate. Evelyn smiled at the camera, almost daring Helen to follow. On the back, written in Evelyn's script, some people survive by running, others survive by erasing. Helen didn't flinch. She tore the photo in half and dropped it into the trash. Claire stopped by that evening. She found her mother sitting on the porch, sipping tea, watching the wind play in the rose bushes. You okay? She asked gently. Helen looked up. I will be. Claire nodded and joined her, their silence warm, not heavy. You did it, Mom, she said softly. You burned it all down. No, Helen replied with a hint of a smile. I cleared the smoke, so I could finally breathe. She leaned back in her chair, eyes calm, voice quiet. Let them vanish. Let the lies drown in their own weight. I'm not here to chase ghosts anymore. In the end, Helen didn't need revenge. She needed distance, clarity, and the freedom to choose herself after decades of choosing everyone else. And as the sun dipped below the trees and the wind scattered fallen petals across her feet, she whispered something only the roses heard. He lost a wife, but I found myself.